thanks very much for inviting me. It's really a great pleasure to come all the way from Washington State. I've had the opportunity to be back here a few different times speaking at Shellfish Forums on the Chesapeake, and it's a fascinating area with a wonderful history of shellfish production. A lot of history based on public fishery, and out in Washington State, we've taken a different approach to our shellfish production than here in the Chesapeake, where it's been intensive aquaculture essentially for over a century. So the Taylor family that I work for has been at it since 1890. They started growing shellfish in Washington State, 5 generations now in the business. And so I'll just talk through some of the different things that have evolved with aquaculture out there in Washington. The industry there in Washington State supports roughly 2,700 jobs, direct and indirect jobs, about $270 million in annual economic activity that's generated by the aquaculture, shellfish aquaculture there in the state. Washington leads the country in that farm shellfish production. In a couple of the counties and a couple of our coastal counties, it's either the largest or second largest private employer. So it's a big economic driver in our rural areas out there. So as I mentioned, the Taylors have been at it since 1890. The gentleman on the lower right here is J.Y. Waldrop, the great-grandfather of Taylors who started in the business. They're building Olympia oyster dikes in this picture here. Native oysters that we grew early in the industry are very susceptible to temperature extremes, so they used to terrace the beaches, build these dikes to where they could keep water over the oysters if there was going to be temperature extreme days and keep them from either cooking or freezing. I also should mention something very different about the industry in Washington State compared to the Chesapeake Bay is we have big tidal exchanges. And so we're here, you know, you've got a few feet of tidal exchange maybe over the course of a day. In Washington State, depending on where you are, it's generally somewhere between 10 and 15 feet. So big areas of tideland that are exposed at low tide, and most of our farming is done on those intertidal areas that are exposed at low tide. So this is our native oyster, very small, full grown. That's a 3-year-old oyster there, and that's what our industry was based on. Again, a wild fishery for that native oyster in the 1800s, and like often happens with wild fisheries, the resource was being over-harvested. So when we became a state, shortly after statehood, some of the first laws passed by our state legislature were oyster laws. They took all of the productive oyster beds left in the state, made them oyster reserves, not for sale. And then they passed 2 additional laws, the Bush Act and the Callow Act, that allowed for barren tidelands to be sold into private ownership, specifically for the purpose of growing that native oyster. If you did anything else with that land, if you tried to fill it or develop on it, the state would take it away from you. But as long as you grew native oysters on it, you could own it, which was really instrumental to the growth of our industry because it gave you an asset that you could take to the bank and borrow money against to buy seed and make improvements on that land, build your oyster dikes or whatever. So really fundamental to the start of our industry in the early 1900s. As I mentioned, 5 generations of Taylor family working, growing shellfish. This is where our different operations are located. We're mainly in Washington State. We own or lease about 11,000 acres of tidelands in Washington State. We have farms in British Columbia now, in California, Northern California, and Humboldt Bay. We have a large nursery operation, and out in Hawaii, we also have a big hatchery nursery operation out there. There's about four major hatcheries on the West Coast. Taylors have 2 of them that supply oyster seed to all of the shellfish farms on the West Coast. So in Washington State, as I mentioned, we opted to sell those tidelands into private ownership. So this is just an example in northern Puget Sound and Samish Bay. All those different polygons out in the bay are oyster tracts that were sold in the early 1900s, owned by different companies out there, Taylors included. Myself included. I forgot to mention that I have a shellfish farm of my own. I grow clams on the side when I'm not working for Taylors, and so I own 32 acres up here in the middle of the bay as well. Grow about 70,000 pounds of clams a year on my farm. This is showing the production of shellfish in Washington State, and the gold color on the bottom is the oyster production. But this is just to show the diversity of our industry. And I also just want to point that out because I think it speaks to the success of our industry, both our industry and our company, is that we grow a diversity of species, and we grow in a diversity of areas, so we have diverse geography. So if you have red tides or an oil spill or pollution issues. You've got multiple areas you can always keep product coming to market from. If the multiple species, same thing. If you have a disease issue or you have a market crash, you've got diversity of species to work in the market. Then we have diverse markets as well. We sell our products all over the world. So the focus for our oyster production is largely the Pacific oyster, introduced from Japan in the early 1900s. That native oyster, as I mentioned, is really a vulnerable oyster, very sensitive oyster to grow. In the early 1900s, we had problems with the pulp and paper industry. The pulp mill effluent was killing our native oysters. So for decades, we fought the pulp mill industry in court, trying to address the water quality issues. In the meantime, we needed a hardier oyster that could tolerate the mill effluent, and we found the Pacific oyster from Japan to be the best. It grows well in the Pacific Northwest, but doesn't reproduce particularly well. So for 50 years, the industry sent a representative to Japan to buy seed. They loaded it onto ships in these wooden crates, and when the ships arrived in Washington State, the oyster growers would meet the boats, unload the seed, and take it out to their farms to plant it. That went on for roughly 50 years. Now today, we've transitioned since the late 60s, early 70s, we've transitioned to hatchery production. This is our hatchery on the Hood Canal in Dabob Bay. Again, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the different activities in the hatcheries with the larvae production and tanks. A lot of us have gone to these flow-through tanks now. It's much more efficient than the big batch culture tanks. Of course, you need algae production to feed those larvae while they're going through the different stages of development in the hatchery. We have another hatchery I mentioned over in Kona, Hawaii. So one of the problems with growing shellfish in Washington State is in the wintertime, the sun goes out, it starts to rain, and the water gets cold and your animals go dormant. So if you're trying to produce babies in a nursery, it's really hard. You're fighting Mother Nature with greenhouses to grow algae, having to heat that seawater up to feed these guys to get the metabolism up so they'll eat this algae that you're fighting Mother Nature to grow. And finally, somebody 20 years ago in our company very smartly thought, well, let's go someplace warm. These things are small. You can put 20 million of them in a 6-pack beer cooler with a gel ice pack and fly them anywhere in the world. Let's go someplace where it's warm and easier to do this. Off to Kona we went, where there's an aquaculture park there, where they have basically hot and cold running seawater and 330 days of sunlight a year. This is next to the airport there in Kona. When you fly in, you can see this huge aquaculture park on the left. Taylors have a small area there leased that we're producing our seed in. So an intermediate step in between the hatchery, the larval stage, the free-floating stage, the first 3 weeks of their life, and actually going out to the farm, you've got a series of nursery steps that you have to take these guys through to get them big enough to actually have survival on the farm. These are up-well, down-well boxes, a very common nursery system that's used on land for these small single oysters, clams, mussels, whatever it might be. And then we move them into the water. This is our Flupsy floating up-well system in Oakland Bay near the town of Shelton. This is a huge facility. I would submit maybe one of the larger in the world of this type. It's got I think about 350 bins full of shellfish. These are the bins that are in that Flupsy. Paddle wheel propelled, very efficient electricity-wise, to raise these small single oysters up from a couple of millimeters up to the size of my thumbnail to where we can take them out on the farms and plant them out. In Northern California, we have another large nursery facility there. It's going to be, when it's fully developed, it'll be twice the size of that facility in Oakland Bay. So generating a lot of singles. These are those up-well, down-well boxes in the foreground and Flupsies further back there, and that's just continuing to fill out. Ironically, this is an old pulp mill that's been shut down, and where we've got these filter feeders cleaning the water used to be where they parked the chlorine barges to pump the chlorine into the pulp mill to bleach the paper and then discharge that chlorine to the ocean. So it's kind of a nice turn of events for water quality in that area for sure. Seed graders, big part of growing small single seed is to have it uniform in size. You know, we used to try to adapt equipment from the United States, other industries, to try to grade our seed and do different things. And we finally got smart and went to Europe, where the industry is much bigger. And so we buy a lot of our equipment out of France and Italy now. And so this is Mulot, is a company that makes seed graders over in France, producing the small single seed. Oyster shells, obviously important to us as well. It's culture material. We set our baby oysters on it, just like you do here in the Chesapeake. So from our processing facilities, we saved our shells. Over the years, it's become less important. As we start to produce single oysters, we have less of a demand for seed. But when we're producing clustered oysters for shucked oyster meat production, the shells are still important. They go into the plastic mesh bags, which go into fiberglass tanks, and larvae introduced from the hatcheries to produce that seed that you see here with a spat on the shells. Now we've transitioned to single production, so we use shell flour, ground up shell, and a lot less shell because you're using these tiny shell fragments instead. And right now the company's looking at transitioning. We're experimenting with these. Again, going to France is well worth it for those of you in the industry if you want to learn. That industry in France is 10 times the size of the industry here in the United States, and they've got a lot of good ideas, and they're willing to share them, and been over recently a couple years ago and really had my eyes opened up for sure, and others in the Taylor family have been over recently as well. This is one of the things we're looking at real seriously. They call them coupelles. They're French spat collectors. You know they're good because that industry has evolved just in the last few years to almost totally embracing these coupelles as their means of producing seed. They set them on these little plastic discs. Some cases they lime them to get better set, in some cases not. But then they have machines that you feed these coupelles through that strip the oysters off, and you get all these single oysters coming off these coupelles, and it's just an amazingly efficient way to produce single oyster seed. This is from our Flupsy single oyster seed. Again, this boat's just loading up 2 different types of seed, both the single seed in the foreground and the cultured seed on the back for cluster production. We plant everything by water. This is just an example. So we'll have our farms that, we've cleaned a crop off of a bed, prepared it, we've got mark stakes on it, and the boat will go back out at high tide with a load of seed and just spray it off, similar to what you do here as well. A few years later, hopefully you got a crop that looks something like this. This is out in Willapa Bay on the coast. If the area is too muddy to support a crop on the bottom, we do a lot of longline culture, where we take that mother shell and string it into a braided poly rope and support it up on stakes up off the ground and produce a crop up off the ground. These are for shucking oysters, for shucked meats. This is just a drone photograph of some of our long lines up in Samish Bay, northern Puget Sound. We've been doing some work with GoPro videos recently. We're always challenged by trying to assess the impacts that our farmed crops might be having on the environment. And so GoPro cameras have been a nice tool for us to go out and make that assessment and go, set that camera up on your crops and see what's going on when you're not out there when the tide's in. And it's really a pretty vibrant habitat, lot going on out there. This has stimulated some interest. These videos that I shot 2 summers ago have stimulated some interest from NOAA. We've got a project going on with NOAA to actually use the videos to try to quantify the habitat values. So we do our harvest at low tide. We load our big steel cages up, these 20-bushel tubs. We load them on the boats at high tide, take them out to the beds where we're going to harvest, push them overboard. The crews come back at low tide, fill those tubs up. Tubs all have ropes and buoys on them so the tubs can be retrieved again at high tide when it comes back in. Some of our harvesters are happier than others. This time of year, it's hard to find any happy harvesters because our low tides are in the middle of the night this time of year. So basically from September to March, all of our crews are working in the middle of the night doing the harvesting. So not quite as much fun. Here we are picking up the tubs when the tide comes back. We grow a lot of beds just of singles now. As I said, the company's transitioned to where, 25 years ago when I started working for them, 80% of our oyster production was for shucked meat and 20% of it was live in the shell. That's totally reversed today to where the vast majority of our production is going into the half-shell market today. The single oysters there. Another method for growing the singles, this is what we call our Goku oyster. It's a flipping bag. You can see all these bags have buoys on them, so as the tide comes in, that bag rotates up. As the tide goes out, the bag rotates down. So the oysters are constantly in motion, tumbling in that bag as they grow. It changes the shell morphology, and it gives the oyster a deep cup and a really hard bill. It takes all the fluting off the shell. It makes just a perfect half-shell oyster. You can see the deep cup on those oysters and how smooth the cup side is on that. Shigoku in Japanese means the ultimate oyster, just a part of our marketing scheme to really put this out there as a premium product. It obviously takes a lot of effort to grow this oyster. Kumamoto is another species of Japanese oyster, Crassostrea sycamia, that's one of our most popular half-shell oysters that we grow. This was introduced in Washington State in the 1950s by our Department of Fisheries as a potential replacement for the native oyster. But it's turned out to be one of our most popular half-shell oysters now with the Oyster Bar Trade. This is our main Kumamoto oyster farm in Oakland Bay. Lots of oysters there. This is a really productive area. We actually grow Kumamotos on the gravel on the ground. Underneath in the gravel, we grow manila clams. So we'll harvest the Kumamotos, send a crew in there, dig the clams out, replant the clams, replant the Kumamotos, and start the cycle over. Incredibly valuable piece of ground here. Kumamoto's on the ground there, harvesting the kumos. Lots of oysters there, you can see. All hatchery produced. Our farm's in BC, mostly suspended culture, deep water leases up in British Columbia. I think we have about 650 acres of leases in British Columbia now. We started going up there about 15 years ago because of permit challenges in Washington State and how hard it is to get new farms permitted in Washington State to grow our business. So there's a lot of farms for sale in British Columbia. So we've taken advantage of that where they're all permitted, and we just have to go in and bring seed to the party, and we're off and running producing shellfish up there. So these are just for Taylor, so you get a sense of the size of the company. This is what we're doing approximately annually for oyster sales. About 40 million oysters live in the shell, 10 million as shucked meats. We do quite a bit of frozen half-shell oysters, so we take the top shell off and freeze them with liquid nitrogen, really high-quality freeze there. The second picture from the right there is going into the nitrogen tunnel there, puts a really high-quality freeze on them. Do a lot of exporting, and then we also have our own oyster bars. We've got 3 oyster bars in Seattle now that we're selling oysters in as well. Again, this is just to show you the diversity of what we're selling. The lower half is essentially oysters. The dark blue big pie is our half-shell oysters. The shucked is the smaller pie on the left, and then the shucked is the green, and then the frozen is on the left there. So, but then just to show the diversity of the products that the company produces, again, that I claim is a large part has to do with the success of the company, that diversity. We have our own boat fabrication and nursery fabrication. We have 12 full-time welders that work for us, just building boats and building nurseries. This was our first big boat that we built. So just real quickly on some of the other products, the manila clams that we do. This is my clam farm up in Samish Bay. I grow clams in rows under 4-foot wide predator nets, and I've mechanized the harvest. I've adapted a tulip bulb harvester to dig my clams. So really pretty efficient for me. And this is me just earlier this past week out on a night tide doing some harvesting. The finished product, the Gooey duck clam, our famous burrowing clam that is so photogenic. So we plant them in these nursery tubes for the first couple of years, and then the tubes come off, and then they go 4 or 5 years without a tube. So it's a 6-year crop for us, but a very valuable clam. You know, they're worth, farm gate, they're worth maybe $25 a clam to the farmers. So that's what they look like coming out of the ground. Finished product. Mussels is the other thing that we do from rafts. This is the only floating culture. Well, the floating culture in BC is oysters, but in Washington State, the floating culture for us is just the mussels. And challenging, floating structures, more visual impact, challenge for permitting. I think we've got the distinction of the longest and most expensive permit ever. We just 2 weeks ago got our permit for a mussel farm that'll have 50 rafts, 20 years, $2 million, and we just finally got our permit to put a new farm in. So processing, frozen oysters, retail stores. I'm running out of time, just the oyster bars in Seattle. We have a couple of oyster bars in Hong Kong and a distribution center in Hong Kong as well. So this is the permitting process if you want to get a farm permitted in Washington State. Come on out, it's really easy. That's sort of the mindset there, one of my favorite cartoons from the water quality challenge is a big deal. That's what I spend a lot of my time on. When you privately own the tideland, if you have water quality degradation in a growing area, you go fight to get that cleaned up because you can't move to another area where it's cleaner. That's your land, you have to protect it, so we spend a lot of time on that. We do seed sales to encourage people that own tidelands in front of their house to grow shellfish. That helps us with the water quality battle as well. Ocean acidification is one I spend a lot of time on, and I'm out of time. Too many slides, sorry.
Good. 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll take a break and come back and have a discussion. Yes, sir, can you say your name again?
Boy, it's really diverse. We have a whole range.
You saw his daughters, right?
Yeah, the family there for sure, but we have a lot of Caucasians, we have Hispanics, Cambodians, Vietnamese, you name it. I don't know how many different languages we speak on the farms. It's pretty impressive, but yeah. It's, we do well with labor because it's aquaculture, it's year-round, it's steady jobs, they're good wages, we pay benefits, we have medical, we have vacation, we have 401k. So, we pull people out of the migrant loop and they become part of the community and they stay with us, so.